What a beautiful week, weather-wise, it was last week, wasn't it? And just makes you glad to live in Kansas. It was nice, beautiful. Didn't make it to the Maple Leaf Festival, though, yesterday. Had every intention, no, I didn't. Had no intention of going. I caught myself in a lie. I'm not interested in bunnies with dresses, and crafts don't do anything for me. But I'm sure it's a great weekend for those who love that kind of thing, Josh. So, all right. No, I won't be able to make it today either. Something's come up. I hope you have a Bible, and we'll turn to Romans chapter 12. We're only going to look at 2 verses this morning, which is kind of unusual for me. I've mentioned before, when I set out to preach Romans chapter 12, like I always do, I kind of looked for some resources and found a book of sermons from Martin Lloyd-Jones, pastor of Westminster Chapel in London from I've mentioned it, about 1935 or so, all the way up to about 1969 or so. And 13 of those years were spent in the book of Romans. So when I got the book of his sermons on Romans chapter 12 and saw 11 sermons on verses 1 and 2, I thought, well, I don't have time to go through all of this. I'm going to have to kind of go through it a little bigger chunks than that. But it's there, and there's stuff there, and I'm kind of glad to be able to just break it down into a really small chunk here this morning. There are some of us in the room here this morning that recall the troubled state of New York City back in the 70s. Crime was at an all-time high in the early 70s, which corresponded with the fact that then tourism was at an all-time low. Some of you remember that in 1975, President Gerald Ford denied federal assistance to save New York City out of bankruptcy. I mean, New York City was going bankrupt well before European Union countries were threatened with bankruptcy. In 1977, I remember this, it was the year I graduated from high school. Remember the blackout of New York City and the chaos that ensued. There was looting at an all-time high. Over 4,500 people were arrested in a short amount of time. It was a mess. New York City just was awful. And so they did what you would think someone from New York City would do. How do you rectify this? How do you remedy this? How do you fix the problem that this city was in? Well, they went to an ad agency in Madison Avenue, which is what you would figure, right? They turned to a guy named Milton Glasser, who developed what has become one of the most recognized logos in the history of advertising. How many people have seen this? We've all seen it. You go to New York, there's T-shirts, coffee mugs, they stick that on everything. He drew that in the cab ride on the way to the ad agency. It's another one of those things you look at and you're like, how do people get paid for that? And I could have come up with that. The church in Rome was not in the crisis that New York City was in when Paul wrote them a letter. Doesn't seem to be in as much chaos as the church in Corinth was. But just the same, from all of Paul's writings to all the churches he wrote to, we can say without question that Paul was the church's biggest fan. He was the number one proponent of the church. Yes, Jesus as well, but Paul was not one of those who said, I like Jesus, you can have the church. Paul said, I love Jesus, and because I love Jesus, I love his church. took the privilege of coming up with a logo that I think reflects Paul's feelings. It's totally original with me. I don't know where I got that inspiration, but I'm pretty sure that would be the logo that Paul would have. Paul loved the church because he knew that the church was the bride of Christ and the body of Christ, that it was the family of God, it was the household of God. And so Paul loved the church. He loved churches that struggled with pride and arrogance and even immorality like the church in Corinth did. Paul loved startup churches like were scattered all throughout the island of Crete. He loved established churches like the church in Ephesus. And so when he would write these churches, or the men who pastored these churches, without fail, he would remind them first and foremost of the love God has for us and has demonstrated for us through Jesus Christ, his Son. And secondly, he would remind us of the love that we are to have for one another without fail. He would include this in his letters, the love that we are to have for one another and to demonstrate for each other. The pattern of his letters to churches illustrates this. Part 1 was almost always filled with theology and doctrine. In the case of Romans, it's 11 chapters. In the case of Ephesians, it's 2 chapters. But he fills it with the knowledge that we are to have of God's activity, his great love, his mercies, his grace, in short, the gospel. And then part 2 of his letter is practical teaching on how to live in light of these great truths that he's written about, including how the church should love its members with the love that God has showed us. So last week, or if you're from Baldwin, next week, it's that weird thing we'll be looking at how every Christian is graced with a spiritual gift, a God-given ability to minister in such a way that others are blessed and benefited and God is glorified. And Paul in Romans chapter 12 lists gifts like prophecy, serving, teaching, encouraging, giving, leading, and showing mercy. Now, in the perfect church, all believers would exercise their gifts. They would know how the Spirit has gifted them, and they would use their gifts in a way that would build up everyone else in the church, and that everyone else in the church would appreciate everyone else's gifts and exhort each other to continue using those gifts. There's this one small problem. There's no perfect church. There wasn't one in the first century. There's not one in the 21st century. So when Paul continues writing in Romans 12, after he finishes talking about the body and the individual parts of the body and the gifts that those individual parts have, he will turn in verse 9 and start talking about love. And it's not a random, unrelated thought. He didn't just pick a new topic. Next thing that comes to my mind, oh yeah, love. Now, if you know Paul's letters, you will recall that he does the same thing in his letter to the Corinthians, the book of the Bible we know as 1 Corinthians. There he spends an entire chapter, 1 Corinthians 12, discussing what he wrote in one paragraph of Romans 12. Namely, that the church is a body made up of many parts, and the parts of the body correspond to the many gifts that God has given. So now, if Corinth was a perfect church, Paul could have left it at that. We're a body, we all have different contributions to make. Let's go. Let's make those contributions. Let's go on. But Corinth was not a perfect church. Rome wasn't a perfect church. Gardner is not a perfect church. Baldwin City is not a perfect church. So after discussing the church as a body with a variety of gifts, Paul quickly turns in 1 Corinthians 13 to discuss something else. What is that? Say it. Love. He does the same thing in Romans 12. Why is that? Why is it after discussing the beauty of the church as a body with contributing parts that he would have to follow that up with a discussion about love? It's because we are prone We are prone to compare ourselves with each other. And the moment we begin comparing gifts and comparing contributions, then that gives birth to competing against each other. We're prone of thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought, that my contribution is greater than your contribution. Some of us are prone of thinking too low of ourselves. I don't make a big contribution, not like so-and-so makes a contribution. Which is why Paul then exhorted us, as we saw last week, that we are to think of ourselves with sober judgment, that we are to see ourselves as God sees us. Equal playing field, sinners, redeemed, but gifted. Now, if Paul only wrote this way once, we could dismiss it as a particular problem to one or two churches, but this is the way he writes in all of his letters. By the way, in his letter to the Ephesians, he just reverses the order. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 2, he says, "Be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love." And then in verse 7, he will say, "Each of us has grace given us as Christ apportioned it," and he will list gifts. Because this is how he writes, because this is so important, I think there are a couple of conclusions that we need to draw attention to. The first is, the point of being the church is not just activity, it's community. We are not just to be busy doing things. We have a lot of organizations, good organizations, don't hear me saying that, a lot of good organizations that are filled with just activities, service projects. But we don't stop there in the church. The point is to use our gift in a way that benefits everyone else in the body, complements them, not showing off our spirituality, but building up the body. So when we appeal to you to be involved at Fellowship Bible Church, and it's part of our vision statement that we are centered on God, connected to others, called into ministry. We believe that strongly, that every believer is called into ministry. We're not just emphasizing that so you won't be bored, so you'll have something to do, but so that the church will be blessed. And you will be in the process. The church will be blessed by you as you exercise the grace gift God has given you. It is not for you to determine whether or not you have anything to offer the church. It is not for you to determine whether or not you have anything to offer the church. God has already determined that you do. When gifts are employed in love, the church is a community, not just a beehive of activity. The second conclusion that I think we can draw is that the best way to experience community is to be a contributor. So we don't just sit back at church and just say, why can't we all just love each other? Let me tell you, folks, the best way to experience love in community is to be an active part of the community. Throw yourself in. Make your contribution. Be the part of the body we need you to be because it's unique and necessary. I have to hand it to my sons, Cole and Logan. When they moved here, it was, a whole new world, not just a new city. Wiggins, Colorado, everyone, literally everyone knows everyone in Wiggins. They moved to Gardner, and I think of Gardner as a small town, but to them it was a metropolis. They went from 30 in their graduating class to 400 now in Cole. But what they did was they just threw themselves into the community. Cole just immediately, I'm going to play on the soccer team. And it just opened up doors. And pretty soon, because he made this contribution, he felt a part. It's the same thing in the church. Don't just sit on the sidelines. If you want to feel and experience community, be a contributor to the community. And you'll feel it. You'll experience it. And you'll grow from it. So let me just make a quick aside here. If you're sitting there this morning thinking, I have no idea what you're talking about in spiritual gifts, this is all fuzzy to me, this is all, this is just strange, then we will be offering classes again soon. We're working on when we can do that. We used to offer those classes pretty regularly. We need to get back to that practice, and we will be offering that. So keep an eye out for a class, a seminar, a weekend, sometime where we can discuss with you and teach you about the spiritual gifts that God has given you as a believer. But the Christian experience does not end with the practice of spiritual gifts. As Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13, love is the most excellent way. Because love is the most excellent way to use your gift. Love is the most excellent way to receive someone's gift. And so just as he did in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul turns our attention there to love. Love, he says, must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. You may have heard before from a preacher or some other source that the Greeks had distinct words for love. We just throw out that word and it means a lot of different things. The Greeks broke it down more carefully. Agape was that unconditional, self-sacrificial love. It's kind of the overarching concept of love, and they had a specific word for that, and Paul uses that in verse 9. Agape love. There was also a Greek word called storge, and that's kind of the tender, affectionate love. It's the love that a parent would have for a child. And so it's that kind of specific, and they had a word for that, and Paul uses that in verse 10. Then they had the word phileo. We get Philadelphia out of that, brotherly love, but it's more kind of like that friendly love, and Paul uses that word in these verses. And then they had the word eros, which is sexual love. It's the only Greek word for love not found in the New Testament. I say all that to say Paul does not compartmentalize love any more than God does. All that is good about love is good for the church. Every facet of love is good for the church all the time and in all ways. Agape love, affectionate love, tender love, brotherly love, kindly love, it's all good for the church all the time. The first word, as I said, in verse 9 is agape, the overarching word for love. It's the foundational love on which all the other love is built. And so what's going to help us get to the heart of love? So I'm going to borrow Paul's phraseology from 1 Corinthians 13. I'm going to apply those to Romans 12, verses 9 and 10. Let's get to the heart of love. What is it that we're talking about? Let's define it. First of all, love is authentic, Paul says. It must be sincere. Some of your versions say, let love be genuine. Most of you know I've got 2 grandsons, and they are starting to get to that age, especially Lucas. He's getting to that point where he begins to know how to say, I love you, when he wants something, right? And it's tender, and it melts your heart, and you'd give him the world if it was yours to give. But it's manipulative. In that sinful little nature of his, it's manipulative. But I expect that of a toddler. Paul says that's got to be done away with in adults. Let love be genuine, authentic, real. Now, having said that, let me quickly point something else out that I think throws people into confusion. Can we demonstrate love to someone when we don't feel like loving them? I hope so. Absolutely yes. And that does not make us hypocrites. It just means we have a weak understanding of agape love. Love is doing what is best for another person, which will almost always require some level of self-sacrifice, even when it's not pleasant. This love Paul's talking about is so far from mushy sentimentalism. And I'm not saying that love is void of emotion. I'm just saying Agape love is not fueled by emotion. It's about commitment to others, especially in the church, as Paul writes it here. It's about doing what builds up the body and appreciating the contribution others make in doing the same thing. So when he says to love authentically, he's simply saying love with no strings attached. Love as God loved. So think of this with me for a moment. If God waited for us to love him back properly before he showed his love to us, in other words, if God's love were conditional, folks, we would never see another sunrise. We'd never experience another soaking rain. We wouldn't have another meal on our table. Think of Jesus' life. Jesus healed lepers who never said thank you. He fed multitudes that had no idea they were eating a miracle meal. He died on a cross for people who mocked him and ridiculed him. But he demonstrates his love for us. Authentic love does not require being loved back. And love isn't shown so we will ultimately get certain results or reactions. Love is authentic. Secondly, love is godly. Now again, you might, as we read this phrase of chapter 9, it sounds like chapter 9's maybe removed from verses 6 through 8, and then within chapter 9, he's just got another random thought. Oh yeah, I thought of this thing too. I better write it down while I'm thinking about it. But it's related. Hate what is evil, cling, attach yourself to what is good. What he's telling us is that love is not just authentic, love is also godly. Because love does not embrace anything that makes, or everything that makes a person happy or gives them pleasure. We are not showing love when someone we care about is engaged in something that is ultimately dangerous and maybe temporarily pleasurable. That is not love to turn a blind eye to sin. Oh, I couldn't say anything. I love them too much. No, you don't love them enough. God is love. Of that there's no argument. And precisely because he is love, he hates evil because all evil works against drawing us closer to him and closer to each other. Folks, evil always creates division, never unity. Evil always promotes selfishness, never sacrifice. Evil always tears us apart. It never builds us up. So consistent with his character of love, God can say in Proverbs chapter 6, there are 6 things he hates, 7 that he detests. Haughty eyes, or eyes that look with jealousy or lust. A lying tongue. Hands that shed innocent blood, hearts that devise wicked schemes, feet that rush quickly into evil, false witness who pours out lies, a man who stirs up dissension among brothers. We don't ignore those. We love people indiscriminately, not the things people do. Love is godly. It reflects him. We don't love others then when we say, I love you, but never place their needs ahead of yours. Those words then become empty, don't they? We don't love ourselves when we love evil and distance ourselves from good. And we don't love God. No matter how often we attend church or pray or put money in the plate, if it's all just lip service and guilt-reducing ritual. Love is godly. Thirdly, love is affectionate. Now, again, I said earlier, it's not mushy sentimentalism, but that does not mean that love is void of emotion altogether. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Again, remember, the foundation for all this is agape love, a self-sacrificing decision. So it is possible to decide to be kind or even affectionate toward others. You can change. We are being transformed, right? So if this is not your natural bent, it can become more natural the longer we remember the mercies of God, offer our bodies as living sacrifices, no longer conform to the pattern of this world, but allow ourselves to be transformed. Change is possible. Those of you who know me well know this about me, that I fight a critical attitude. I have a sinful bent that makes me think I am right 99.9% of the time. And what happens then is that critical words and critical attitudes can rise up in me quickly. It's an act of agape love to quiet them. It's an act of phileo love or brotherly love that I not only keep criticism quiet, but actually show kindness towards someone doing something I don't think is the right way to do it. And the more I do that, guess what? I find out that their way was better than my way. What's true in the church, what's true in those relationships is equally, it's infinitely more equal or true rather in marriage. Because marriage is a reflection of the church, isn't it? Listen to the perspective, the conclusion that one marriage therapist wrote. Contempt is the number one factor that tears couples apart. Contempt. If you've ever been to the family life marriage seminars that organization puts on, early on in the weekend, Friday night, one of the first things you do is you turn to your partner, your spouse, and you say, "You are not my enemy." And it sounds like such an obvious thing, but it is not so obvious because we allow things that our spouses do to just irritate us and build up in us, and we think we're right and they can't be right, and the way we see things are right and they see things as wrong, and we start building up contempt. And this therapist is saying what I find out is that contempt is killing the marriages. People who are focused, he goes on to say, on criticizing their partners miss at least 50% of the positive things their partners are doing, and they seldom see, or they miss 50% of the positive things their partners are doing, and they see negativity when it's not even there. People who give their partner the cold shoulder, deliberately ignoring the partner or responding minimally, damage the relationship by making their partner feel worthless and invisible, as if they're not there and not valued. Then he goes on. Kindness, on the other hand, glues couples together. That sounds so simple. Kindness is one of the most important predictors of satisfaction and stability in a marriage. Kindness makes each partner feel cared for, understood, validated, loved. There's a great deal of evidence showing the more someone receives or witnesses kindness, the more they will be kind themselves, which leads to upward spirals of love and generosity in a relationship. What a great recipe for marriage. What a great recipe for a church. Someone should write that down. Paul did. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Clinging to what is good. Let love be devoted to one another. And he says, in brotherly love. Fourthly, love is pleasant. Love is just pleasant. People who are pleasant, people who love this way, are people who are glad to see you. And aren't those the kind of people you like to be around? People who love this way are people who have good things to say. People who love this way are people who are gracious and they're thankful. They're pleasant. They're pleasant to be around. Paul envisions a whole church of pleasant people. That's good. And lastly, love is enthusiastic. honor one another above yourselves. Your version may say, outdo one another in showing honor. That's not competition, that's a mindset. The original words literally mean that we should lead the way in showing honors to others. Don't let an opportunity go by. Take the initiative and show honor when honor is due. Don't wait around for people to recognize you. Be alert to what others are doing and honor them willingly and enthusiastically. It takes a very particular mindset to get there. It takes an I am third mindset to get there. I think I was in 6th grade when the TV movie Brian's Song came out. You know, you go back and you look at some of those movies from the 60s and 70s, and they really weren't that good, but it just had a profound impact on me. It was the story of Gale Sayers and Brian Piccolo. They were running backs for the Chicago Bears, and they became very close friends, and Brian Piccolo contracted cancer and eventually died to that disease. And there was that scene where Gale Sayers is in the hospital bed with him, and in his hospital room, and he's beside his bed, and just he begins to cry, and I just remember bawling my eyes out and not wanting my parents to see me, but I was so touched by this. What I didn't know was that the storyline for the movie was based on Sayers' book called I Am Third, based on his conviction that God is first, others second, I am third. I am third people are a joy to be around. They honor one another above themselves, enthusiastically. They look for opportunities. They look for the opportunities. I read just this week an actress. I don't have any idea who Amy Adams is. I just read this little blurb. Don't know what movie she was nominated for in an Oscar last year, but she was on a flight last year from Detroit to Los Angeles to do some filming. And when she saw a serviceman, a U.S. soldier, get into the plane, she just became convicted. He needs my seat up in first class. And so she quietly tried to ask the flight attendant to switch seats, which they did, but there happened to be a journalist sitting next to her and heard this going on, and of course, before the plane leaves, has to tweet, because everyone has to know what everything's going on in the world, and tweets that Amy Adams gave up her seat for a soldier. And when they've landed in Los Angeles, the press corps is there. And she just said, I did not want any attention on myself. I wanted it on him. That's the mentality. That's the mentality. People who love live with an I am third mindset. It's not random. It's not sporadic. It is their lifestyle. They find their joy in doing for others as they would like having others do for them. I am third people who honor one another above themselves, frankly, are too often taken for granted. But that still doesn't even deter them from honoring others above themselves. What I have found is that I am third people have great energy and enthusiasm. They make the people around them better. They rely on God more consistently. They live with an attitude of humility. And that's not theory, folks. That is reality. I know this because I am married to one. I know this because I am privileged to see it every day in this church. People who do things, I just think, what a sacrifice. What a sacrifice. No one's making them do this, but they do it. Paul wanted nothing more than for an entire church to love enthusiastically as they outdid one another in honoring one another. So I go back to what we said the very first week. If you believe the gospel, you will become like the gospel. And you will be known by your love. A love that is authentic, godly, affectionate, pleasant, and enthusiastic. I don't have to tell you, that is not the pattern of this world, is it? It requires being a new creation. The new creation God intended you to be when He touched your life with the gospel. Let's pray. Our simple prayer this morning, God, is that we would grow in our love for each other. As we love you, Father, would you teach us to love others? Open our eyes, God, to see those opportunities that we so often slip by our notice. Teach us, God, to open our eyes so that we can see how to build each other up, honoring one another above ourselves, being completely devoted to each other, loving authentically, loving truly and godly. This is our prayer, God. We pray this in the name of the one who is love, Jesus, our Savior. Amen.